I guess if I keep planning to do this, then I really should start off with like an intro of sorts, so let's workshop that part real quick. My name is obviously not Wet Spork, but I'd like to be called that, and the rambling part is going to be pretty accurate if you listen to like anything beyond a minute of this video. I think that's going to be good for the moment, so now I can get to the meaty question I was actually wondering about. The question being, assuming we can apply some rationality, at what point do the values we impose on other people conflict with our own, if not basic reasoning as well? Luckily, this should be pretty easy to make examples of in this case, so I'll generally describe how I at least view how we perceive others in relation to our personal values first. Obviously, to describe values is a pretty simple task. This becomes a tad more difficult when we question the validity of having values in the first place, particularly when most applications of said values are arbitrary or made for the sake of other values. But I want to keep this simple, so we're not going to dwell on whether or not values are valid to have, which is contradictory to even say if nothing is valuable. I'll define values as being the worth we apply to things in the context of which we personally view the world. I think this should be satisfactory for the argument I plan to make, considering that values differ widely from person to person, but are all synonymous in the fact that they are a guideline for how those people live their lives, as well as forming their identity. While many people would say that they are willing to change their perspective, it is also true that what any individual is confident in believing will essentially be their own individual truth. By this, I simply mean truth in the sense that one might say it is true that killing someone is bad, not in any cosmic sense. Assuming what I said is true, then from our own perspectives, we will view other people's truths as being misguided, despite the other person's truth being just as true to them as it is to us. I think this way is how we can find ourselves imposing our views on other people, for we believe them to be, in some way, a superior mode of existence. But then this questions some priorities that led me to question this dynamic in the first place. Now, a lot of people would suggest that imposing one's views on another is a bad thing, and this is particularly a valid point when we consider the differentiating factor to be that another individual will approach life differently and is therefore suited to some other mode of existence rather than the one that works best for you. But we typically reserve this viewpoint in cases in which we truly believe that a certain change in another person will lead their lives to a greater outcome. This then calls into question the role of happiness in this sort of imposition, because in the end, happiness isn't something everyone strives for. For instance, one person might strive for a monk-like state, removing from themselves all kinds of worldly desires. Now, there's an argument, depending on how you define happiness, on whether or not this would be considered reaching a state of pleasure due to the accomplishment from oneself, but I'll refrain from that for now. What I do want to suggest is that, depending on our priorities, such as happiness, is there a case in which the views we hold, which should be the most important considering it makes up our own reality, would be wrong, even according to our own standards, to impose upon another person? For this, I will provide that simple example I was talking about at the start of the video. Let's say that you, being a good person, want your friend's life to be as happy and fulfilling as possible. Let's also say that you have a solid foundation of values of which you believe are the best way to achieve this sort of happiness, valuing truth, community, compassion, nature, reality, abstinence from drugs, or other such common things. Now imagine that your friend, who you care so much for, is regularly taking this physically harmless drug that takes away from some of these aforementioned experiences, but gives your friend great happiness to an extent that it more than makes up for the ones that they are now missing out on. This provides a sort of dilemma, and while it's nothing extreme, it begs the question of where you hold your priorities. Do you ask that your friend stop taking the drug, believing that it takes away from the life experiences you hold so dear, or allow them to keep taking it because at the end of the day, it grants them extraordinary happiness? Both of these options seems to be a conflict in how we view what should be in the best interest of your friend. After all, we value things beyond simple pleasures too. Of course, we can make the question harder by simply assuming that your friend's foremost infallible desire is being as happy as possible. At the end, most people, including me, will feel pretty conflicted. We want what's best for our friend, but what we think is best for our friend is based on the things we find personally valuable in the world. There's definitely a hesitation in choosing the drug, but it seems that at least for them, if happiness is their only goal in life, it's the best decision despite whether or not we approve of that mode of existence. Now that I've fleshed out my example, I'd like to give a sort of review into what this might help us learn, including myself. I don't think that you should feel bad about believing others would be happier living the way you live or holding similar ideals. I mean, after all, we can suppose that these work for you, and imposing them might be you simply trying to lead others to the same happiness result as you. Of course, what I said before sort of comes back around in the fact that people operate differently, and what happiness means to them, or if they even value happiness, can be completely different from our own. For instance, the murderer who gains the most pleasure from killing others and the pacifist who gets pleasure from helping others would likely not succeed in leading the other to happiness, particularly if they are firm in where they find their value. I think the reality, though, is that most people, including me, are not firm in what they find valuable and where they might find it. They may even find that they are mistaken or simply have had a surface level knowledge of the means to obtaining what they find valuable. I think it's obvious we've come to the conclusion that not everything we believe should be imposed on others, but if we truly believe we can help another person achieve their goals, or even help them to define said goals, assuming we align with those goals, which is an important factor too, then I believe that this approach is fine as well. We would have to evaluate our approach, think of the other person too, and consider the options available, but it's certainly viable. What I mean to say is that this video shouldn't discourage you from trying to help others, only to consider the extent to which we assume what works for us must be good for them as well. In any case, find out your priorities as well as others and use your best judgment. After all, that's the best that any of us can do anyways. That's about all I have to say for now, so have a good day.